Hi, I'm Caroline.
And I'm Adrienne.
And this is Scandal Sheets. Hello and welcome to Scandal Sheets, the podcast that explores the scandals of the past along with the people and places associated with them. I am your host, Caroline, and with me, as always, is...
I'm Adrienne.
That's right. You always seem so surprised when I send... Like, am I seriously on this podcast?
I am. It's just so hard to believe that
right.
I've been welcomed into the fold of podcasting.
Yes.
Yeah.
That's because you're that awesome.
I love it. Thanks.
So today we are going to be venturing to Gilded Age, New York to explore the scandalous life of Stanford White. You may know the architectural firm that he was engaged with more than his name, maybe. Mm-hmm. He was with McKim, Mead & White, who did a good portion of Gilded Age architecture.
Starchitects.
Particularly up north. Very, very popular, well-known architecture firm. But old Stanny had quite the reputation that we will be venturing into with this episode and next week as well. So put on your boots. No.
Top hats?
Your top hats. Grab your canes. We're putting on the Ritz.
Oh, that's okay.
No, I don't know.
That kind of works.
Maybe?
Sure.
Okay, why not?
That sounds fancy.
Okay, so Stanford White was born on November 9th, 1853. His parents were Richard Grant White and Alexina Black Meeks.
What?
Alexina.
Okay.
Alexina.
All right.
Yeah. I've never seen.
No, that's a new one for me.
I've never seen that one before.
Even with the interesting names in history.
Right. So I think it's worth kind of venturing into Stanford's parents and what they were up to before he came along.
Sure.
Richard Grant White was sort of a jack of all trades, but he moved in avant-garde circles. He was born into an old Massachusetts family, and by old, I mean they were some of the first Puritan settlers.
Wow.
So he studied at multiple institutions, most notably New York University. Then he apprenticed to study medicine, and then he later apprenticed to study law. It seems like he was having a hard time deciding what he wanted to do.
Someone else had a hard time deciding.
Right.
Was that Frank Lloyd Wright's dad?
Yes, he was the one who was like constantly changing jobs. Yeah. With Richard, however, his situation was that he was expecting to inherit a fortune from his father. So it was kind of like, I can dabble in this, dabble in that. Doesn't matter. Got the money in the
Dad'll
pipeline.
Provide. Right.
Unfortunately for Richard, his father's business went bankrupt, and they were left with practically nothing. So Richard went to work in the law, and along the way became one of the foremost literary and music critics of the late 19th century. Very interesting, I think.
That is interesting.
Now, he would also serve in which is basically the precursor to the United States Coast Guard during the Civil War. So now in 1850, he married Alexina Meese, whose family was from Charleston, South Carolina.
Really?
Yes.
How do you spell her last name?
Meese. Meese.
Okay.
But I've also seen it Mease.
All right.
And since that is where we're broadcasting from,
right.
and I've actually never really heard that last name.
I haven't either.
In connection to any Charleston families. I had to look it up.
Okay.
And so I found out that she was actually born in New York City.
Oh.
And it was her grandfather, who was from England.
Okay.
He immigrated and settled in Charleston originally. I think her father may have spent some time here as well.
So when would that have been that her grandfather came over?
Probably
So 17.
Yeah, late 1700s. I think that sounds pretty good.
And he had the same last name?
Yeah, I think that was Mies. Yeah, Mies was the last name. They apparently spent enough time in Charleston to where Alexina's father was very good friends with a Charleston planter named Alexander Black, and she was named after him. I don't know why they didn't go with Alexandra.
Yeah.
But they
just
chose,
to be different.
Yeah, definitely. So she was named after him because he was going to leave her his fortune, essentially. Unfortunately for her, Alexandra was wiped out after the Civil War, so she didn't receive any money either. The Whites were poor,
done for, destitute.
They were just bad luck. How do you find two people on the face of the planet who expected to inherit money and then didn't get a dime and married each other? So Stanford White was born into this family, and he was the second son. And as I said, impressive backgrounds, but little to no cash. His father was quite the dandy, which I think basically translates to he spent too much money. He was also friends with some of the foremost artistic people of the day, including Louis Comfort Tiffany, the famed stained glass artist,
right,
and Frederick Law Olmsted, who was a famed landscape designer we've discussed before. I like to think that Stanford was kind of growing up amidst this, and I think that might have kind of affected him in terms of what he ends up doing. Yeah, inspired him. So Stanford had no formal architectural training, which to me says that he actually might have had a real gift, but maybe not.
He definitely did.
Yeah, okay.
He did. To not have any schooling and to do what he did, he for sure was extremely gifted.
So he interned with Henry Hobson Richardson, who is one of my favorite architects. He was, at that time, known as one of the greatest living architects of that period.
He was, yes.
He was responsible for a style called Richardsonian Romanesque, which is beautiful, but some people kind of find it too heavy. A lot of rusticated details, and heavy stone, and things like that. If you're familiar with Boston, he designed Trinity Church. So that's one of his kind of signature buildings. Now, Stanford worked with Richardson for 6 years, and then he took off for a European tour because no architect can be an architect without looking at European architecture. Right, Adrienne?
That's absolutely correct. Right. Yes.
So, when he returned to the U.S., he joined Charles McKim and William Meade to form McKim, Meade, and White. There's a lot going on in Stanford's life, professionally speaking, but there's also a lot going on in the world of architecture in the U.S.
The American Renaissance that occurred between the years of 1876, so our centennial, and 1917, saw advancements in technology and architecture and lots of pride in the nation. The Renaissance started with our centennial, but 17 years after that, hundreds of thousands visited one of the most beautiful and memorable World's Fairs in Chicago in 1893. So there was just a lot going on leading up to and around the turn of the century. And when White was an apprentice with Richardson, his timing was just so good to be able to work on the Trinity Church in Boston on Copley Square, and work with somebody that had just such a great presence in, the American architectural profession and had an educational pedigree that White definitely did not. So Henry Hobson Richardson's firm was also an incubator for an architect with whom White was to partner a few years down the road, and more on that in just a minute. So when he was with Richardson, White really proved himself as a capable designer and a draftsman. One of the commissions for Richardson's firm was to design the William Watts Sherman House in Newport on Bellevue Avenue. And White's responsibility was to design the library. So he successfully combined motifs from Japanese design, Art Nouveau, and American colonial design, and he created a cohesive decorative scheme in green and gold. And it's just a beautiful room with these three design elements that you would really never put together. So you have sort of the symmetry of colonialism and sort of the fanciful lightness of Art Nouveau and the symmetry and kind of straightforward geometric shapes of Japanese design. And the room is incredible and very kind of current looking.
I noticed that, and I was looking at some photographs of his work.
Mm-hmm.
He really just, on his interiors, he did some pretty crazy stuff.
Oh, yeah.
Just like, I mean, there was one that actually, I think it was in his own home, had an exposed steel beam in the room. Like
I saw that too.
I was like, wow, that's like some modern stuff.
I know.
Yeah.
And not having any education to build off of as an architect and just starting. So when he was a draftsman for Richardson, the only thing he was looking at was pattern books and I guess drawings, because this is before he even went to Europe. So yeah, he was really able to use this precedent and design these rooms without being in college or grad school or anything. So 7 years after the William Watts Sherman House and a part of a different firm, he designed the Isaac Bell House in Newport, also on Bellevue, which is an amazing shingle style house that I have visited, and it's definitely worth looking at photographs or traveling there. So in between the apprenticeship with Richardson and working on the Isaac Bell House, he was in Europe. So he stayed for 15 months, and he left in 1878 and sketched and painted and continued his already fairly strong interest in interior design, interior architecture. So his home base in Europe was in Paris, and he stayed with his sculptor friend, Augustus Saint-Gaudens, who would create work for Stanford White later. So White returned in the fall of the following year, in September of 1879, and found his friend Charles McKim, who was the former draftsman at Henry Hobson Richardson's office. McKim was already partnered with William Rutherford Mead. So Stanford White in 1879 became a partner as well, and McKim, Mead, and White was founded. He fit the role they were looking for of a talented interior architect who could visualize and transform a space. And McKim and Mead obviously were extremely talented architects in their own right, but didn't have as much of a handle on creating these interior spaces as White could just produce out of thin air, seemingly. So each of the three had a specific role and personality, and White was definitely the creative genius. They were given very significant projects, even in the early years of this new firm, including the Newport Casino and Villard houses, of which there were 6 at Madison Avenue and 50th Street in New York City. So White was able to design both at a macro and a micro scale. He was talented at creating these perfectly proportioned structures, and also at a small, on the lowest level, imaginative details. And after the Villard houses were completed, that really cemented White's position as a successful project manager. So White had his own house it was at Lexington and Gramercy Park. And it was an 1830s brownstone that he moved into in 1898. And he basically rebuilt it on the inside into a temple of decorative art. You couldn't really tell that there was any changes on the outside, but the transformation inside was amazing. There's some photographs that show an elaborately carved ceiling that was removed from a 16th century chapel in Florence that he had put in the dining room. The columns of the main staircase, were imported from Spain, and there were just various paintings and European decor and just furniture from all over Europe. This is a very Victorian thing to do, because at that time in the design canon, more was more. So that was just what you wanted to see when you went into somebody's house. Just all these beautiful artifacts and art and decorative items just kind of all put into these rooms. So his house was more of a museum of the types of things that inspired him, rather